Before the theory of evolution, it was believed that animals were the product of a celestial design, created by God to perform their destined functions. And it wasn't until Charles Darwin and his book on the origin of species that provided widely acknowledged concrete evidence on the process of natural selection and evolution, that creatures evolved based on a mindless materialistic process of survival and reproduction instead of the creationist belief that we were born into our current forms by a higher power.
Evolution is the change in the heritable traits or characteristics of biological population over successive generations. Process of evolution gives rise to diversity at every level of biological organization, including the levels of species, individual organisms, and molecules. Natural selection is one of the key mechanisms of evolution along with mutation, migration, and genetic drift. It is a process where organisms who are better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offsprings. This basic mechanism of evolution is often misunderstood by having an idea of that natural selection is based on chance. To find out how it works, let's look at a simple adaptation shown by coat color of Oldfield mice. Similar species of normal color mice are found to be prominent in mainland, whereas white color mice, which are also known as beach mice, are found to be prominent in pale sand dunes of Florida's Gulf Coast. Evolution is defined that white color has presumably evolved from brown mainland mice. When these mice invaded the light beach sand, light color mice had a greater chance of surviving without getting spotted by predators. Over time, light color mice would have left more copies of their genes, and this process continued for generations. It is evident that natural selection acting on coat color has an impact on the genetic composition of population by increasing the proportion of genetic variants that enhance survival and reproduction.
Natural selection is, first and foremost, a process which non-randomly filters variation, so that genes which produce better adaptations become more frequent over time. 3 criteria must be met before an adaptation can be created by the process of natural selection. First, the starting population must exhibit some level of variation or diversity for the exhibited trait. Without any genetic diversity, the trait will be unable to evolve. We can acquire genetic variation through a process known as mutation, which are the random accidental changes in our DNA sequences that usually occur during cell replication. The majority of mutations are neutral or deleterious or harmful, but a small number can be useful. The useful ones are the raw material for evolution, and the process of natural selection promotes useful genetic mutations in the population. Secondly, genetic variation must be heritable, or able to be passed down from the parenting line to their progeny. Lastly, genetic variation must affect the individual's probability of leaving offspring to inherit the trait. An individual's average number of offspring, otherwise called the organism's fitness, always increases during evolution by natural selection. Thus, the frequency of that trait increases over time as it is passed on from the parent and into the next generation through its numerous offspring. For a trait to have evolved via natural selection, it first must be a modification from an earlier feature or an ancestral trait. Adaptations must also provide some kind of reproductive benefit, or else selection will not take place. To determine that our trait has indeed evolved through natural selection instead of having been created through mutation, we can make a few predictions.
It should be considered that natural selection is not the only process of evolutionary change. Another legitimate type of evolution is the genetic drift. Genetic drift is the change in the frequency of an allele over time due to random sampling of organisms. Unlike in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, in finite size of populations, older alleles may get replaced by new alleles. Therefore, alleles may or may not carried out to the next generations. Genetic drift does not arise from natural selection. What causes the genetic drift? The sampling effect on genes in a finite population may cause genes to become fixed or get completely lost from the population. This will cause genetic drift. Genetic drift will cause the evolution of features that are neither useful nor harmful to the organism. But sometimes the sampling effect can be tremendous so that it raises the frequency of harmful genes even though selection is working in the opposite direction. A genetic drift has to be occurred in any population of finite size, which sampling effect always occurs during reproduction, and alleles are fixed or lost most rapidly in smaller populations.
The theory of natural selection predicts the types of adaptations we'd expect to find and not find in nature. But because evolution can take thousands to millions of years to occur, there was much speculation about whether or not evolution actually happened, since it was difficult to witness within the span of one's lifetime. One of the first people to propose hard evidence that evolution occurred was Charles Darwin, who noted that breeders selectively breed for specific traits in their herds. Today, we call this process artificial selection, providing evidence that evolution does occur because it can happen within a human's lifetime. Unlike natural selection, artificial selection takes about 0.1% the evolutionary time required for it done naturally in the wild. It also creates much more genetic diversity than seen in the wild, with ample variations to plant or animal color, size, shape, etc. Most importantly, artificial selection only meets 2 of the 3 criteria for evolution by selection. This is because it is the breeder, rather than nature's environment, who decides which variants would be passed on via the progeny. Hence, the actual fitness of the trait is unimportant in artificial selection. Instead, it is the breeder's judgment and preferences which determine which traits are more desirable and will be passed on via the next generation. Unlike artificial selection, laboratory conditions let animals reproduce naturally, and because of this, they meet all 3 requirements for evolution via selection. Laboratory experiments happen more naturally than artificial selection, as the only controlled component humans tamper with is the change in the population's environment. These experiments revealed what genetic adaptations an organism will develop to better survive in a particular environment. It was revealed that over time, organisms can develop complex biochemical systems with codependent parts after being exposed to a new environment. Selection in the wild can be viewed as the naturally occurring changes to a species' genetics. Microevolutionary changes are small changes in a few features within a species, while macroevolutionary changes allows a new species to emerge. However, we are unlikely to see macroevolution happen during the limited time of a human's lifespan. One type of selection witnessed in the wild is called stabilizing selection, or when selection has already brought a species into sync with an unchanging environment. Stabilizing selection sets an optimal state for a trait, or the most desired variation of a gene. For example, 7.5 pounds is the ideal birth weight for an infant, as anything above or below it would potentially signal health problems like malnutrition or obesity in the child. Evolution through natural selection is capable of building complex biochemical structures, and are made quickly enough to explain the fossil record as well as add diversity to their complex forms. However, not all complex structures have been proven to be formed by natural selection. We call this the God of Gaps argument, which simply says that in our ignorance, we have yet to understand the acting mechanism behind forming the complex structures which are not formed by natural selection. Scientists hypothesize that complex structures utilize this method where precursors evolve to form new functions, then work together to form an adaptation beneficial to the organism. The delicate and complex structure of the eye is a great example that selection can build complexity given enough time. Working on this theory, Nilsson and Pelger were able to construct an experiment that mimicked natural selection. Starting with a simple precursor, the genes underwent gradual adaptation until the model yielded a complex eye. They conservatively estimated that in the wild, it would take approximately 400,000 years for this type of structure to develop if done by evolution. Observed rates of change during laboratory experiments are much faster than rates of fossil change due to the very strong selection working on it, thus proving that, although slow, selection and genetic drift are two forces that can, over time, create substantial evolutionary changes.